The Callisto Protocol was a game that most people were impartial to. While many can agree that the visuals, sound design, performances, and some of the unique gameplay mechanics really shone through, the otherwise predictable plot, wonky combat, and the rest of the mechanics that were half-heartedly copied over from Dead Space made the Callisto Protocol feel like one of those games that you initially enjoy, but then you immediately forget because you realise that there's other games out there that are just so much better. Sounds harsh, but would you really choose this game over the original Dead Space, Dead Space 2, or the Dead Space remake? No! That being said, when Striking Distance revealed they were going to bring out a story DLC for the game, I was at the very least intrigued to see what they would change or double down on, plus I'm all for more survival horror content. Final Transmission takes place right after the events of the base game, and thankfully there was a small recap that reminded us of what happened, because honestly I'd forgotten. After sending Danny on her way, Jacob is left alone waiting for death until Dr. Mauler tells him there's still a way off Callisto, and so Final Transmission is about Jacob teaming up with Mauler to find data tapes that could help take down Cole, and his plans to unleash the biophage on a galactic scale. And so this new quest brings with it more infected, scary robot/meat hybrids, and a kick-ass new weapon. But this time around something feels different, off, like everything around you is slowly fading away, almost like it was never real to begin with. Nah, it's probably nothing. With all of this new stuff and game time, did Striking Distance manage to address some of the issues from the base game, as well as make the DLC feel like a brand new experience? Well, yes. And no. I feel like I use that phrase too often when talking about the Callisto Protocol, but it has so many polarizing features. Some really benefit the game, and others make it a slog to go through, and unfortunately Final Transmission is still plagued by some of these issues, and its short runtime means you can't really enjoy some of the new stuff it has to offer. That being said, it still has some of those elements that make you appreciate what Striking Distance set out to make. A big draw for this DLC was some of the new stuff it was implementing. Before I talk about the obvious new weapon and enemy type, I want to talk about the smaller additions for now. One that was a great concept but didn't get fully explored enough was that some vents have traps inside of them, forcing you to get out of them as quickly as possible. It was an interesting gimmick that should have been in the main game, because you can't really fully experience it here. Striking Distance, again, trying to make their game feel as much like a survival horror as possible, decided to add a brand new puzzle, and in fairness matches the other mechanics in the game very well, because like them, it's really tedious and annoying. You basically have to flip these glowing red nipples up and down, and sometimes they just say fuck it and move on their own. This leads to some of the most infuriating moments in a game I have ever experienced, and partner it with the dodgy combat, and you've got yourself a combo of fuckery. Now for the main event, the kinetic hammer. After fighting your way through most of the DLC, where the kinetic hammer would have actually been useful, you obtain it far too late into the game, after your trusty baton breaks. RIP baton, you were a real one. I will admit the kinetic hammer was a pretty entertaining addition to the game, as it's a lot more satisfying to smash enemies' heads in. That sounded a bit sadistic. Unfortunately, much like the other mechanics introduced in the Final Transmission, the hammer does feel a bit gimmicky, because it's only introduced to the player due to a new enemy type, the Biobots. Biobots are as expected half robots, half organic. Much like the security bots in the base game, these guys patrol open spaces in the prison, hunting down anything that moves, and isn't completely covered in boils and tentacles. These new versions of the enemy just aren't as intimidating. These guys can only melee you, rather than shoot you, which basically gives you a couple of chances to get away from them, which of course just nullifies their potential of being scary. Plus every other time you encounter them, they just act like normal biophage enemies that can be dealt with in seconds thanks to your hammer. Final Transmission suffers a lot from the mechanics of the game, and the fact that you aren't really able to appreciate the new stuff implemented in the DLC. The main two pulls of the expansion for me were the story and the atmosphere. Horror is also important for a survival horror game. Without it, there's nothing to push you to want to survive, as the experience becomes stale. The Callisto Protocol did a good job with its horror, I felt, as it had a lot of great elements like its droning soundtrack, suspenseful atmosphere, and great sound design that all blended together well to make a good horror experience. Nothing too fancy, just a good solid hint of horror. There was no doubt that Final Transmission was also going to be horror themed, but it explores a lot more of a psychological side of horror that the main game only really dabbled in slightly. Jacob's mind is a complete mess in this DLC, with him not remembering much that transpired a few hours beforehand, which adds a layer of eeriness to the expansion. Why doesn't Jacob remember anything? And hearing and seeing things that aren't there. It really messes with you and starts to make you think if anything is actually real. Throughout the expansion, Mauler is inside your ear, talking to you and acting like the quest giver. Quest givers usually put your mind at rest during games like this, because it makes it feel like they're watching out for you. This would usually be the case, but something about Mauler feels off in this, and you can't exactly put your finger on it. Throughout the whole thing, Jacob is tripping his balls off, seeing and hearing familiar faces that have all long passed. It gives the DLC a Silent Hill kind of vibe, as it messes with your brain. However, sometimes it tries a little too hard to remind you that something is wrong. A big example of this is during a sequence where you essentially get stuck in a loop of walking through the same hallway over and over again. A similar sort of thing was used in PT, and it works a lot better in that game, because everything is a lot more subtle. Whenever something isn't right, Jacob will constantly acknowledge that something is off. It's not a big deal for a character to acknowledge when something is off, but it takes away from the whole suspense of the sequence when the playable character just says,
"Hold on, that's not right. What's happening here? This really makes no sense."
Constantly, instead of just letting you experience it naturally. Did you see that? That was scary, right? You saw that, right? Despite its flaws, the overall mood of Final Transmission is pretty good, and I think that mainly has to do with the ending of the game and what it means for the whole expansion. I admire a game that has the guts to create an ending that isn't all sunshine and rainbows, no matter how much it hurts. And fair play to Striking Distance, because I wasn't expecting that ending. Jacob isn't right at all during this DLC. He sees and hears things that don't add up, and on top of that you can find an audio log in the game of what appears to be Jacob losing his mind. Despite progressing through the story, you don't feel like you're actually getting anywhere. No matter how far you get, there's always something looming over you, and this is confirmed when you finally escape the prison in your ship. You know, your ship, the one that crashed in the side of the mountain during the beginning of the game. This escape is suddenly cut short when we see Dr. Mauler standing over Jacob, who appears to be injured and strapped into a machine, which leads to the biggest twist of the story. Everything that happened in Final Transmission was all in Jacob's head. Turns out Dr. Mauler never needed Jacob to find data, as she used his link to Danny's implant to retrieve it. Escape was never possible, and Jacob and Mauler die in Black Iron. A bleak ending that admittedly fits the game well. This was the highlight of the DLC for me, and looking back on it actually makes me appreciate it a lot more. It would have been easy for Striking Distance to cheapen the ending of the base game by having Jacob fly into the sunset, but they did what they felt was right for the story, and so fair play to them. So with that being said, I give this expansion 3 Jacob torsos out of 5.